It is the Sanatana Dharma which for us is nationalism. This Hindu nation was born with the Sanatana Dharma. With it, it moves, and with it, it grows. When the Sanatana Dharma declines, then the nation declines. And if the Dharma were capable of perishing, with the Sanatana Dharma, it would perish. The Sanatana Dharma, that is nationalism. The wisdom of India lies in the fact that the truth can manifest in manifold ways and it can be reached in manifold paths. And so the nationalism of India, therefore, understood in this sense, is profoundly important, not just for India, but for the world as well. Because that allows it to say that, look, we can all coexist, we can all be ourselves, and yet we can feel a sense of living oneness and unity with others around us. I want to thank Dr. Sampadanand ji for the kind invitation to speak to all of you this morning. And the canvas of my topic is very large, Sri Aurobindo, India and the world. So I can draw upon a lot of different ideas and inspirations to approach this. But I think I quite like what Dr. Sampadanand just now started with, trying to understand Sri Aurobindo's notion of nationalism and seeing how it ties into his international outlook. So, the idea of nationalism is something which is, of course, very much the flavor of the day, and we have, over the last more than 100 years, been very engaged with developing this notion and how it applies to India as a modern republic, a new country, but an ancient culture. Now, what I'm going to do over the next roughly 1 hour is to first speak about the idea of nationalism as it develops in a universal sense in Europe initially, and then how it has a uniquely Indian flavor at a certain point where Sri Aurobindo plays a very important role. And then speak also about the other trend which has been gradually growing in the world over the last 100 or 200 years, which is internationalism. Because the two themes are part of our global world order. On one hand, we have the national spirit, the rise of the national spirit, and on the other hand, there is also a need and a very obvious requirement of international peace and prosperity and a stable world order. So how do we reconcile these two ideas in the light of Sri Aurobindo? That is pretty much the approach of today's session. Now, Sri Aurobindo wrote 36 volumes over the span of his life. It adds up to some 21,000 pages of writing. And why I'm saying this now is to tell you that if we want to understand Sri Aurobindo's views on nationalism or internationalism, we must draw on a variety of sources. Sometimes there is a tendency to read writings from a certain period and consider that as if it is his last view on the topic. And that is a danger that we must be careful. Because even as an individual, his views on nationalism, his ideas evolved in response to a changing world. He did not live in a static world. So when we quote Sri Aurobindo or we want to understand his ideas on nationalism, we have to keep in mind that the world that he lived in changed very rapidly over the course of his life. When he entered politics in 1906, India was under foreign rule, under colonial rule, where even the idea of an independent nation was inconceivable. And there Sri Aurobindo plays, of course, a very important role in putting forth the idea and waking up people to the possibility of it. Towards the end of his life, India is a free nation. The world has changed. Colonialism is dying. And the United Nations has been formed. So in the span of those 40 years, we see the enormous changes that took place in the world. And so his own writings on these topics have to be seen in the context of those changes. Now, the other thing which is interesting is that in spite of this evolution of ideas that I am referring to, Sri Aurobindo also, if you look carefully, seems to have a vision right from the very beginning of a future where both nationalism and internationalism coexist. Now, I want to start with reading. I like to refer to the original sources because I feel that adds a lot to our understanding. Instead of listening only to my interpretation of the text, it is useful, I think, to approach the text directly. I want to start with a small passage from his 15th August message. Now, as I'm sure you are all aware, Sri Aurobindo's birthday was on 15th August, and in 1947, when India attained independence, he was asked to give a message to All India Radio. And in this message, there is a paragraph which was very interesting, and it sets the tone for our talk today. He says, "I have always held and said that India was arising not to serve her own material interests only, to achieve expansion, greatness, power, and prosperity, though these too she must not neglect, and certainly not like others to acquire domination of other peoples, but to live also for God and the world as a helper and leader of the whole human race." Now, this brings up the question as to why should India have this role as helper and leader of the whole human race? Is this something that every nation would like? Isn't this a status or a position that every nation in the world would like, to be helper and leader of the whole human race? So what is it that India specifically, in terms of its wisdom or its approach, what is unique in that approach that makes Sri Aurobindo say this? So that's what we have to try and understand. Now, if you look at, in all social and political science, there are two terms which are fundamental: the individual and the group. Now, our development of human history over thousands of years has been a story of successively growing aggregates. We start with tribes and clans and small kingdoms which grow into empires, and at a certain stage, these empires turn into nations. And what is interesting is that every successive aggregate, every bigger unit that is formed, does not dissolve the lesser ones. So, for example, we today identify with India as our nation, but our family unit has not dissolved. Our provincial, state level identities also remain. I feel Bengali while I feel Indian. Right? So there is a transition that takes place, and that brings in a certain complexity. And in fact, a lot of political science is trying to deal with this complexity of identities. So you have an identity which is more narrow, and you have an identity which is wider. How do these identities reconcile is one of the challenges of all political science. So what is interesting is that if you stretch this idea to its extreme, the individual, right, is the starting point, and the widest circle that you can draw around the individual is the whole of humanity. So we come to an idea where we have the one person and the many people. And this is something which even in, for example, there are references even in the Vedic texts, for example, to the idea which kind of, it highlights the fact that we are individuals living in a world with many people. This movement from one to the many also finds echoes in philosophy. And this is a hint to the role that India has to play as leader or a helper of the human race that Sri Aurobindo says earlier. Because the idea of the one and the many is fundamental to Indian thought and philosophy. And we will come to this a little later. For the moment, it's enough for us to recognize that all of human history has been a growth of larger and larger aggregates. Today, we find ourselves poised between the nation and the need to exceed the nation. So if you look at various movements or trends that have taken place in the world over the last 50 odd years, nations have tried to come together to create groupings, such as, for example, the European Union or the United Nations. In Asia, we have been less successful in South Asia in particular, because of the fundamental problems that exist in the way that partition happened. But the trend of moving from nation to internationalism is there. On the other hand, it is also a pendulum, because it seems to swing at some points of time towards internationalism. At other points of time, it seems to revert back to the national identity. And in fact, many would argue that over the last 20 or 30 years, the pendulum has swung back towards nationalism, where people want to feel much more a sense of identity with the nation. But that does not augur well for a collective human experience, because it means that nation states arm themselves and entrench themselves in positions which put them in conflict with others, and it leads to potentially destabilizing world order. So it's a very confusing situation. Should we be proud of our national identity or not? Is it necessarily opposed? Is nationalism and internationalism necessarily opposed to each other? In the vision of Sri Aurobindo, they are not. But for that, we must understand what is his vision of nationalism. So let's begin with talking about the French Revolution, because that is when, for the first time, there was a radical shift from an old system, the monarchical system of kings and rulers, to a situation where for the first time the nation state as an idea was manifesting. And this was a landmark event, not just for the French or for European history. It was a landmark event for the world political scenario, because for the first time, people saw themselves as being able to come together, not under a king or a ruler, but a system which they would have a say in, which would reflect the common interests and aspirations of people. It is not as if democratic or quasi-democratic systems did not exist in the past. We all know examples in ancient Greece, even in ancient India, though it's often not mentioned. Even ancient India had kingdoms or republics which were democratic in nature, even if they did not use the word, obviously. But the difference between modern nation states and these earlier democracies is the scale. The scale at which this was happening, the size of these nation states is formidable. The second important thing is that these nations were bringing together various diverse elements within their groups and forming something which tied them together. Meaning, take for example France. Today we think of France as a country, as a single country. But it is also made up of many different sub-identities which came together to create the French identity. In India, of course, it goes without saying that we have a tremendous diversity. And Sri Aurobindo, in fact, in The Ideal of Human Unity, one of his works, he highlights this. He says, nature tried an experiment of unparalleled complexity with India. How much diversity can you create and yet hold together? So, nation states, as they formed in the last 200 to 300 years, create a new form of governance. At the same time, we have to be careful, because the cultural unity that precedes these nation states take many centuries to form. So you may have a French Revolution which is a catalyzing agent of political change, but the preparatory work that precedes such an event takes place over centuries. That for India, the creation of the Indian nation state may be 75 years old. We are celebrating Azadi Ki Amrit Mahotsav, but the creation of India of Bharat as a cultural entity is something which takes place over centuries, if not thousands of years. So this is also an important idea to keep in mind. Now, the uniqueness of the Indian independence movement, in which Sri Aurobindo, of course, played a very important role. And this was not restricted to India. It was also happening in a few other places, like Ireland, for example. But the uniqueness of these movements in the early 20th century was that in addition to viewing themselves as a political unit, these groups also saw themselves as creating some kind of a deeper soul nation, if you want to call it. So in other words, there was a vision of the nation as an embodied entity, not simply a political state. So this is you can say, a development of the idea of nationalism. And I want to give you an example of this in Sri Aurobindo's own words. This is an extract from a letter to his wife Mrinalini, which he wrote at the time that he had just started being involved in the freedom movement. And he refers in this letter, it's a well-known letter, again, for those of you who are familiar with his work. He refers in this letter to 3 madnesses. And I will not read all of them, but the third madness, he says, is this. Whereas others regard the country as an inert piece of matter and know it as plains, fields, forests, mountains, and rivers, I know my country as the mother. I worship her and adore her accordingly. What would a son do when a demon sitting on his mother's breast prepares to drink her blood? Would he sit down content? Or would he rather run to the rescue of his mother? I know I have the strength to uplift this fallen race. This is not a feeling in me. This is not a new feeling in me, not of recent origin. I was born with it. It is in my very marrow. God sent me to earth to accomplish this great mission. So the idea of seeing the country as the mother, this is a vision of nationalism that goes beyond simply a political perspective. Really try and imagine the period. So before I read them, try and visualize what we are talking about here. This is a little over 100 years ago. This is a time when the vast majority of Indians cannot even think of themselves as Indians. It is still a very nascent idea. The vast majority of people cannot even imagine having independence, of creating their own political independent life. It is in this context that, and also remember that British colonial government was one of the most powerful governments anywhere in the world. The British Empire spanned roughly 1/3 of the Earth's landmass. They were powerful beyond measure. And it is in this context that Sri Aurobindo, Tilak, and a small group of other revolutionaries scattered in different parts of India are voicing a view that is dangerous. That is the word for it. It is very dangerous to say these things back then. We take it for granted today, but to be able to spell it out and to say it, to stand for it meant going to jail, being exiled, being deported, and sometimes even worse punishments. So this is what Sri Aurobindo writes in Bande Mataram in an article called The Present Situation. Actually, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This is a speech, not an article. He says this in a speech. This speech was made shortly after one of his associates, Bipin Chandra, was sent to jail. So he says this: nationalism is not going to be crushed. Nationalism survives in the strength of God, and it is not possible to crush it. Nationalism cannot die because it is no human thing. It is God who is working in Bengal. God cannot be killed. God cannot be sent to jail. Now, you can of course feel the power of those lines even today. But now I want to bring in another idea which will tie into what I have just said. And this is again an extract from an article of his in Bande Mataram. He says, nationalism is an avatar and cannot be slain. Nationalism is a divinely appointed Shakti of the eternal. And now note here, and must do its God-given work before it returns to the bosom of the universal energy from which it came. Why I find this interesting is that even at the time when Sri Aurobindo is emphasizing the rise of the nationalist spirit, even then he is aware that it is a movement which has a time and space. Sri Aurobindo always had this cosmic vision, even when he was involved in the present moment. The idea that it is a God-given work which must fulfill itself before it returns to the universal energy from which it came. He sees it as a necessary stage in the development of human societies, but not something which is eternally final, not in the sense that he was talking about it at that point of time. Now, as you all know, Sri Aurobindo went to Alipur jail and he spent a year there. If you read the Bande Mataram, and then if you read his writings after Alipur jail, you find a distinct difference. And you would be aware also that in Alipur jail, he had a series of spiritual experiences. most famously, which he talks about in the Uttarpara speech. He speaks about how he realized the immanent reality of Vasudeva, of Sri Krishna, in all that was around him. And then notice a passage in the Uttarpara speech where there is a shift taking place, where Sri Aurobindo speaks about nationalism and the rise of India, not in a political sense only, but in an increasingly spiritual sense. And he brings in the idea of Sanatana Dharma. Now, this passage, which is again frequently quoted, is very important, so I want to read it out to you. So this is from Uttarpara speech published in the Karma Yogin. He says, I spoke once before with this force in me, and I said then that this movement is not a political movement and that nationalism is not politics but a religion. I say it again today, but I put it in another way. I say no longer that nationalism is a religion. I say that it is the Sanatana Dharma which for us is nationalism. This Hindu nation was born with the Sanatana Dharma. With it, it moves, and with it, it grows. When the Sanatana Dharma declines, then the nation declines. And if the Dharma were capable of perishing, with the Sanatana Dharma, it would perish. The Sanatana Dharma, that is nationalism. This is very significant because now there is a perspective that ties into the idea of India, which is drawn from a tradition which is much more than just political. And this leads us obviously to the question of what is Sanatana Dharma? What are its fundamental values and objects? And in brief, Sanatana Dharma, of course, is tied to the idea of an eternal reality which can be approached in infinite ways, which can manifest in infinite paths, of a tradition that is not bound to any limited dogma or any limited understanding. And so, tying in nationalism to an idea which is itself vast and multifaceted is one of the most important, you can say, contributions of Sri Aurobindo in his interpretation of nationalism. Now, what is interesting is also to see the same Sri Aurobindo just 2 to 3 years later, writing in a letter to a gentleman, Parthasarathi Iyengar. And I won't read out the whole letter, though for those of you who are interested, you should read the whole letter. It's very interesting. So in 1910, Sri Aurobindo moves to Pondicherry, as you know, and then he remains there till his passing in 1950. At the same time, the movement, the independence movement in Bengal and in Maharashtra and other places is crushed violently by the British. The leaders are exiled, jailed, deported, and all of that. And there is a kind of lull, a brief lull. And there are others who are wondering, what should we do? How should we take this forward? The period of 1906 to 1910 was characterized by a tremendous vital intensity. Even the use of violence, Sri Aurobindo did not, he believed in the necessary use of violence when required, and it was characterized by a tremendous outburst of activity and intensity. At the same time, in this letter, Sri Aurobindo seems to suggest that he was disappointed by the fact that the movement lapsed into a kind of vitalism rather than sustaining itself on something deeper. And this is very important for us to understand because it's a message that even something as important, noble, beautiful as nationalism can get vitiated, can get misused or usurped by other forces. And so he writes to Parthasarathi Iyer, he says, "Be very careful to follow my instructions in avoiding the old kind of politics. Spirituality is India's only politics. The fulfillment of Sanatana Dharma, it's only Swaraj." And then he goes on to say how in the initial stages, when there was this inrush of what he calls a divine force, which came in 1905, the people arose out of this tamas that they were in. But as happens even in the yoga, all the wrong movements, the wrong emotions, mental and moral habits rose and misused the divine force. Hence, he says, that orgy of political oratory, I'm quoting here again, democratic fervor, meetings, processions, passive resistance, all ending in bombs, revolvers, and coercion laws. It was a period of Ashuddha Rajasic activity and had to be followed by the inevitable period of Tamasic reaction from disappointed Rajas. God has struck it all down. And then he says, I do not, in fact, he goes on to say something which is quite striking. He says, at present, it is our only enemy. When he talks about this sort of terrorizing nationalism, he says, at present, it is our only enemy, for I do not regard the British coercion as an enemy, but as a helper, if it can only rid us of this wild pamphleteering, these theatrical assassinations, these frenzied appeals to national hatred with their watchword of Firangi ko maro, these childish conspiracies, these idiotic schemes for facing a modern army with half a dozen guns and some 100 lathis. More power to its elbow, he says. For it is only when this foolishness is done with that truth will have a chance, the Sattvic mind in India emerge, and a really strong spiritual movement begin as a prelude to India's regeneration. And this is again typically Sri Aurobindo. His stress is always on spiritual regeneration. As long as that does not happen, the other can only be steps on the way. In Pondicherry, most of what we read today as Sri Aurobindo's major works, Life Divine, Synthesis of Yoga, Human Cycle, these were all published in a magazine called The Arya. And one of the works that came out at the same time was called The Ideal of Human Unity. And I want to talk about the ideal of human unity now because it presents his internationalist outlook. Right. So this is the second part of our presentation today. So in The Ideal of Human Unity, the book begins with a very fundamental paradox, which he reiterates time and again through the text. What is the paradox? He says, it's very peculiar when you look at human history, the most interesting periods of human history, the periods when there has been the greatest amount of cultural, philosophical, political experimentation, have been periods when people lived in small groups. He gives the example of ancient Greece, city-states of Greece, often in conflict with each other, but giving birth to philosophies and ideas that shaped modern Europe. Ancient India, the Mahajanapada period, which is roughly the second half of the first millennium BCE, when all the most interesting philosophical approaches, the great debates that took place between different traditions, the birth of spiritual philosophy, all of that takes place when India was politically living in small groups rather than in a big empire. The defect, of course, of these small entities was that they were all often fighting with each other and that they were often invaded by more powerful groups. So, for example, ancient Greece was invaded by the Romans, and the Romans created the Roman Empire, which was a vast and large structure which had prosperity, stability, and peace. It sort of assimilated the gains of Greek civilization, but by itself, if you were to compare the Romans and the Greeks were much more prolific in their contribution to human society, and the Romans were much more static. So, the paradox is that we are much more, we as in human beings, humanity, people, we are much more vibrant when we have small, diverse groups. It adds to the cultural richness of our social experience. But we are prone to fighting. They do not last. How long was the golden period of ancient Greece? 100 years at most. If you were to really pick the most important period, the reign of Pericles and so on, 70 years, 80 years, 100 years. How long did the Roman Empire last? Often a figure that is thrown is 500 years, right? Very long period. If you look at the Mahajanapad period, if you see these Indian republics were constantly fighting with each other, one invading the other, one trying to outdo the other constantly. Politically unstable, culturally, spiritually very rich. So the paradox is, if we create a global order of peace and prosperity, of human unity, how do we prevent the loss of diversity? The tendency is, whenever you create a large group, you want to centralize and rule it top down. When you do that, you lose out on diversity. This, it's a very interesting question which came up when the reorganization of the states took place after independence. In the 1950s, as you know, India did not look the way it does today in terms of the way the states are divided. And so there was this question, how should we reorganize the Indian states? And there were two approaches. One which said it should be done on the basis of linguistic divisions. So languages should determine how the states should be reconstituted. The second approach was, don't take languages, do it on the basis of non-linguistic administrative divisions, where you want to avoid creating a sub-identity. And the argument was that if you create linguistic states, you will end up creating disharmony among the different states of India. Fortunately, the members then voted in favor of linguistic states. And why I'm saying fortunately is because, as you can see today, notwithstanding the little insignificant things that happen, India is a much more richly diverse country because each state can celebrate its own culture. This diversity adds to the richness of who we are as Indians. We feel proud, we feel happy when you travel around the country, you land in another state that you have never been, and you say, oh my God, this is so different, they speak a different language, they have different food, but look, I feel proud, this also is part of India. You do not feel in any way, it does not take away from the Indian identity because of that diversity. So, coming back to the ideal of human unity. The paradox is, how do we create human unity on a large scale without losing the diversity of expression? And another dichotomy, which I will just bring in, is liberty and equality. The French Revolution, as you know, had the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, most of the emphasis during the French Revolution was on liberty, freedom from the monarchy, and the freedom to create a new constitutional republic. The next century, so this happened, 1789 is the French Revolution. In the 18th and 19th century, the stress became equality. Because, at least in Europe, not in their colonies, but at least in Europe, countries became free, even economies became free, but there was massive inequality. And so movements began, notably in Germany, which spread to Russia, and then you had the Soviet Union. Revolutions happened which said, enough of this inequality, we want first and foremost equality. And so again, in political science, a very classic opposition is between liberty and equality, because, as is obvious, in states where you stress on liberty and you create conditions where liberty is paramount, you end up having a lot of inequality. In countries which tried to emphasize equality, which said we will share equally, we will divide resources equally, the only way to do that is by taking away your liberty. So liberties were taken away. And the state said, I need to take away your liberty so that I can create a more equal society. And so it's a very strange, again the pendulum is swinging. On one hand it goes to liberty, there is no equality. On the other hand it goes to equality, there is no liberty. And there are many political thinkers, social philosophers who have grappled with this problem. And some of them say the only way you can arrive at a compromise is if you accept lesser forms of liberty or equality. Others say that it is not possible to arrive at any compromise between liberty and equality. We should just accept that liberty is better and live in an unequal world, right? Which is, of course, not a very satisfactory solution. This is again very interesting, because Sri Aurobindo approaches this problem from a very different perspective. He says, in talking about liberty and equality, we have forgotten the third fellow. Why isn't fraternity considered important? So fraternity is at best a sentiment or an emotional feeling. We are all common human race. We are all brothers and sisters, etc., etc. But Sri Aurobindo says the change that is required is very fundamental. And this is, I want to now read out something which is, he says, this is from his Bengali writings. Of course, I'm reading a translation. He didn't write a great deal in Bengali, but a few interesting essays are there. So in this he says, a conflict is going on between these two contradictory truths. However, the fact is that these two truths and feelings are not contradictory. Here he is referring actually to nationalism and internationalism. And he says, nationalism is a truth, internationalism is also a truth. I'm sorry, we'll come back to this a little later. I want to go back to liberty and equality first. So this is from a book called The Ideal of Human Unity, where he speaks about an idea called the religion of humanity. Religion of humanity. The phrase was first coined by a French philosopher called Auguste Comte. He coined the phrase, and he was what we call today a positivist, meaning he believed in a rational world. His idea of religion of humanity was that his religion was basically we should all become rational and have no other religion except for reason, and humanity is our God. The good of humanity is our God. Sri Aurobindo says this is an interesting idea. It's an inspiring idea. It will definitely push certain things in the forefront, but it is not enough. He says what is required is a spiritual religion of humanity. What does he mean by that? So I will read a passage which is profoundly beautiful, which comes towards the end of the ideal of human unity. He says, the liberty that has been so loudly proclaimed as an essential of modern progress is an outward, mechanical, and unreal liberty. The equality that has been so much sought after and battled for is equally an outward and mechanical, and will turn out to be an unreal equality. See, he actually writes this when the Soviet Union has just been formed. So the world is not even gone through the experiment to say that, oh, this is not working. So this is very prophetic, right? I'll just read out that last sentence again. He says, the equality that has been so much sought after and battled for is equally an outward and mechanical, and will turn out to be an unreal equality. Fraternity is not even claimed to be a practicable principle of the ordering of life. And what is put forward as its substitute is the outward and mechanical principle of equal association, or at best a comradeship of labor. Freedom, equality, brotherhood are three godheads of the soul. They cannot really be achieved through the external machinery of society or by man, so long as he lives only in the individual and the communal ego. A society that pursues liberty as its ideal is unable to achieve equality. A society that aims at equality will be obliged to sacrifice liberty. For the ego to speak of fraternity is for it to speak of something contrary to its nature. Yet, is brotherhood the real key to the triple gospel of the idea of humanity? The union of liberty and equality can only be achieved by the power of human brotherhood, and it cannot be founded on anything else. But brotherhood exists only in the soul, and by the soul. It can exist by nothing else. For this brotherhood is not a matter either of physical kinship or of vital association or intellectual agreement. When the soul claims freedom, it is the freedom of its self-development, the self-development of the divine in man in all his being. When it claims equality, what it is claiming is that freedom equally for all, and the recognition of the same soul, the same Godhead in all human beings. When it strives for brotherhood, it is founding that equal freedom of self-development on a common aim, a common life, a unity of mind and feeling, founded upon the recognition of this inner spiritual unity. These three things are in fact the nature of the soul. For freedom, equality, unity are the eternal attributes of the spirit. Now, this is really revolutionary for a number of reasons. One, note that it takes the political ideals of the French Revolution, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. It combines them with the Vedantic experience of the self, because he's speaking of unity. It combines it with this profound spiritual realization that until we realize that we are fundamentally one in the core of our being, you cannot have real brotherhood. Until you don't have real brotherhood, liberty and equality cannot be reconciled. They will always be opposed to each other. And he applies this Vedantic principle to a collective sense, not only as an individual salvation for mukti or liberation, but in a collective sense. So this is something which is absolutely fascinating, because it really brings in so many strands of the human experience together. It takes these profoundly noble values from the West, combines them with ancient Indian spiritual perspective, and then applies it in a collective sense. So this is really unique, and it has never been done before or perceived before in this sense. I want to go back to what we said about the vision of India and Sanatana Dharma, because this is really where Indian nationalism and internationalism come together. The reason Sri Aurobindo stresses so much on the rise of India as necessary for the world, when he says that India must be the leader and helper of the human race, in his vision, his whole stress is not simply to say India as an economic, political, military power, though of course those are all things that must grow in measure. But the real stress is on this approach to knowledge and identity which is not known. If you think about it, most of the problems of the world today in the political sphere are linked mostly to the question of identity. Even today, if you look at Russia and Ukraine, it's a question of identity. Are the Ukrainians Russians or not? Is this territory Russian or not Russian? Who do you belong to? And you can break this conundrum of identity across various other social problems, whether it's related to class or countries or religions or various other issues. And this is where India has a key which is unique, because it has contemplated identity for thousands of years. It has gone to the core of what it means to be us as human beings, as persons, beyond all these limited, temporary, temporal identities. And this has been thought of, discussed, written about, or passed down as a knowledge right from the Vedas, in the Upanishads and beyond. And that is where Sanatana Dharma plays a crucial role, not just for the resurgence of India, but as a solution to various problems in the world as well. If you look at the idea of the self in India as it was understood over many hundreds of years, this self is capable of infinite forms, but the path to realize that self is the number of paths to realize that self are equally infinite. And so there is unity and multiplicity fundamental to this idea of self. There is unity and diversity. There is the one and the many. All these paradoxes that I mentioned to you earlier are reconciled when we see them through the prism of the self. There are so many. Ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, right? Tat tvamasi. You are all fundamentally that. There is one truth, and people express or speak of it in different ways. And it's something that repeatedly comes across over the centuries and over the generations. We often say, for example, that all religions have the same truth or the same goal. And there is a truth in that, of course. But I think it is more important to say that all religions seek for the same essential truth. But these approaches are quite different. And the wisdom of India lies in the fact that the truth can manifest in manifold ways and it can be reached in manifold paths. And so the nationalism of India, therefore, understood in this sense, is profoundly important, not just for India but for the world as well. Because that allows it to say that, look, we can all coexist, we can all be ourselves, and yet we can feel a sense of living oneness and unity with others around us. Yeah, I want to kind of move towards now the closing of this session, and then we'll open it to questions, and then I want to quickly tell you a little bit about the book that we have written. So there is a passage where the mother writes, she says, the future, this is in 1954, and she says, the future of India is very clear. India is the guru of the world. The future structure of the world depends on India. India is the living soul. India is incarnating the spiritual knowledge in the world. And I want to highlight the spiritual knowledge aspect, because that is really what India is rising for. That is the whole meaning and value of when we speak about Swaraj and nationalism. It is in this sense that we must understand this rise. Going back to the 15th August message, I'll end with that quote and then talk a little bit about reading Sri Aurobindo. In the 15th August message, where he speaks of his 5 dreams, he says the first dream was a free India. The second, he says, resurgence of Asia. And the third dream, he says, is human, the ideal of human unity. The fourth one is the spiritual message of India going out to the world. And the fifth one is, of course, tied to his ultimate goal of transformation, of the descent of the supramental, and the total change of human consciousness. Now, when he speaks of the third dream, he says this. He says, unification is a necessity of nature, an inevitable movement. Its necessity for the nations is also clear, for without it, the freedom of the small nations may be at any moment in peril, and the life even of the large and powerful nations insecure. The unification is therefore to the interests of all, and only human imbecility and stupid selfishness can prevent it. But these cannot stand forever against the necessity of nature and the divine will. But an outward basis is not enough. There must grow up an international spirit and outlook. International forms and institutions must appear. Perhaps such developments as dual or multilateral citizenship, willed interchange, or voluntary fusion of cultures. And now note, he says, nationalism will have fulfilled itself and lost its militancy, and would no longer find these things incompatible with self-preservation and the integrality of its outlook. A new spirit of oneness will take hold of the human race. So really the work before us as a rising nation in the 21st century is apparently paradoxical. Because what we are being asked to do is, on one hand, rediscover our roots, regain our sense of what it truly means to be Indian in its deepest and widest sense. And at the same time, paradoxical, because at the same time we are saying, while we root ourselves in this deeper nationalism, we open ourselves to the possibility of a world where every country has its role and its place, and there is interchange, fusion of cultures, a growing sense of the unity of humanity, and not just of our independent, separate, isolated existence. When these two things can come together, and it is only the spiritual knowledge of India that would allow something like that to happen, then we would live in a world which would be moving towards peace and prosperity and diversity and order and fulfillment in every true sense. So this is a thought that I want to end with, and also to summarize by saying it is not a question of choosing one or the other. It is not, should we be more nationalistic or should we be more international in our outlook? The answer to that question is we must be both. And we can be both, because our sense of identity is not a limited ego, but the infinite self, which can manifest in every possible manner. So this is as far as the talk on the political and cultural philosophy was concerned. And I just want to, for 5 minutes, tell you a little bit about our new book. You would have noticed that through the session today, I have I have given you about 8 or 10 different extracts. And what is interesting is that, as I mentioned at the start of the session, Sri Aurobindo has 36 volumes. If you look at the complete works, it's bigger than the span of my hands. And 6 million words, 21,000 pages. He touches upon, of course, social and political philosophy, which was our talk today, but he also touches upon literature, spirituality, commentaries on the Vedas, the essays on the Gita, the Upanishads. He writes poetry. There are translations from various languages, predominantly Sanskrit and Bengali, but also from some other languages. There is a number of letters that he writes to disciples to guide them in their sadhana, in their yoga. Letters on himself, his own life and his yoga. So there is just a formidable body of work which is of interest to anyone wanting to get a deeper understanding of things. You know, for a brief period when the Arya came out, it was also translated in French, because the mother was there in Pondicherry in the initial few months that the Arya was coming out. Subsequently, she had to leave because the First World War broke out and French civilians were not allowed to stay in Pondicherry during the war. So she had to leave. But while she was in Pondicherry, the Arya, as it was coming out, was being translated into French and was also being published. And what is interesting is the French name for the Arya is very interesting. It was called, the translation of it in English is the Grand Synthesis, the Grand Synthèse. So the Grand Synthesis is pretty much a summary of what Sri Aurobindo's approach is in all his writings. So he's synthesizing many different perspectives, ideas, visions, the Eastern and the Western, the modern and the ancient, the spiritual and the material. All of these different things are being synthesized in a new fashion. And so, whether you read The Human Cycle, which is his social and political philosophy, or if you read The Life Divine, which is his philosophical integral yoga philosophy, all of it is coming from the same perspective, but it is being cast in a very different form. In The Human Cycle, for example, he uses the word spiritual right at the end of the book, and only after he has defined it in a certain way. He does not go into much about what spirituality in its fullness means, because he's writing for an audience that is primarily interested in the social and political issue. And of course, if you read The Life Divine, it's a profoundly spiritual, work of spiritual philosophy. So why I'm saying all this is basically to highlight that Sri Aurobindo had a very vast body of writing where all these different texts come together to present a unified vision of the world and of humanity. One of the challenges that I think a lot of people face, and I've been asked over the years, is which book of Sri Aurobindo to start with? What should we read? Where do we begin? And there is, as you can imagine, no simple answer to this question, because it depends very much on your temperament. What is your question? What are you seeking for? That really determines what you should start with. And for others, it doesn't matter what you start with. Once a contact has been made, it will lead you in its own way into the discovery of Sri Aurobindo's works. So to answer to that need, my co-editor Gautam Chikarmani, who unfortunately was not able to make it this morning, and we came out with this book which is called Reading Sri Aurobindo, where we invited different people to come and introduce or share their reading of each of the volumes. So 36 volumes, we have 21 contributors, where we basically try and introduce what is the essence of each volume. So if that is of interest, I just wanted to put this out here. Please have a look at this book. And we also chose contributors from a variety of backgrounds. It's not only academic scholars. We didn't want to simplify it so much that it becomes simplistic, but nor did we want to keep it so academic or so. Sometimes there is a tendency to intellectualize it so much that it becomes inaccessible. So we wanted to keep it as straightforward as possible. So we asked a variety of people, some of them older, some of them younger, Indians, foreigners, people living in the ashram, people living outside, all different age groups. And it's quite an interesting compilation of an introduction to each of the complete works. So the first question on Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam actually ties in very well to what we've been talking about today. The idea that to see the whole world as your family, to recognize that the recognition of the other as your own is something which is so central to this vision that you just mentioned, that it ties in very well to what we have been saying. That you can be rooted in your sense of identity and still perceive the other as a part of your own, as another aspect of your own person. With regard to the COVID vaccines, well, I mean, I'm not an expert in the field, so I don't know too much. But all I can say is that certainly it was widely reported, as you know, that India had the capacity to produce vaccines not just for itself, but also was able to share a lot of that with countries around the world, and was able to give that to countries around the world. And I think it's a very, my personal perspective on this is that it showed great statesmanship on the part of India in a time of difficulty to share what was considered to be a very important tool in fighting against the disease. People may have, of course, all kinds of opinions with regard to the vaccine and so on, but I think that the fact that it was willing to, step up and play a role as a statesman, I think it's really remarkable and perhaps not sufficiently recognized. So this is an interesting, the sentence that you read out is actually from Vande Mataram. Nationalism is a religion that has come from God. And it ties into the spirit of nationalism that Sri Aurobindo was referring to when the country was absolutely steeped in a kind of tamasic ignorance. And suddenly there is this pressure that manifests in people to wake up, to question, to demand, to ask for something that is rightfully theirs. And it is in this sense that for Sri Aurobindo, nationalism was not only a political movement, but a movement that was profoundly connected to the resurgence of India as a culture and a nation. Now, your point is that the divine created the world as one, and therefore nationalism is kind of divisive in a certain sense, if I can catch what you are saying. But that's the beauty of it, that multiplicity is also an aspect of divinity. Unity is certainly divine, but so is multiplicity. And this is the profound wisdom of India, that the divine is not only in a withdrawal from all existence so that we arrive at oneness, but the many is also the divine. The problem is we are not usually conscious of neither the oneness, and therefore the many becomes opposed to each other. Well, in a sense, everything is being created by the divine, right? Including the multiplicity. Because these identities are formed right from the beginning. The fact that there are two people is a multiplicity. The fact that there are more than one is a multiplicity. So it's fundamentally, it's fundamental to nature as well. That's a very important question. Question was, there's a thin line of difference between internationalism and globalization, and whether Sri Aurobindo has covered this. So globalization, of course, refers to a view or a perspective where there is interchange of goods and services and a close sort of connection, primarily economic, but also social and cultural and so on. Problem, of course, with globalization is that very often it is driven by market forces. And when it is driven by market forces, it is controlled by large corporates and large companies. And over the years, people have become more and more aware of the dangers of globalization, because it tends not to encourage diversity, but to kind of create a kind of homogeneous capitalist culture, the problem with globalization is that it promotes a certain homogeneous view of the world, which is very different from the internationalism that we are talking about. This perspective of internationalism is one way we are saying each country must feel proud, not in a jingoistic way, but must feel a sense of ownership of their own culture. An expression of that diversity is important and essential. Not that we arrive at a world which kind of all looks the same and feels the same and is driven by, artha, by market interests predominantly. And Sri Aurobindo did not really speak much on the topic of globalization, also because as a trend, it really took off after the Second World War. And he left his body in 1950, so it had not really emerged. But he does speak of these movements towards the end of that book, Ideal of Human Unity. He refers to the possibility of such movements. I don't know, I feel that my sense, and this is of course once we go into these sort of social questions, unless we have figures and statistics, it's very difficult. But my sense is that when I was in college 20 years ago, my sense is that our generation was much more keen on leaving and going out than the students I interact with. Today, when I teach the younger generation of students, the sense I have from many of them is that they want to go out, they want to experience what it is like in the West and study abroad, but they're very keen on coming back. Almost all of them will say, in 15 years, I'm coming back. In 10 years, I'm coming back. Which was not the case, at least in my, a significant number of people were thinking about, how am I going to leave? The idea was, there's not much that can happen here. We need to go and settle somewhere abroad and make our life. So I think honestly that more and more I feel that India is a very exciting prospect, even for the youth. And they would like to very much come back and build their careers or the country or whatever else. So I'm quite optimistic on that front. Only solution is when it is founded on something deeper. When you feel that sense of oneness so deeply that you are not disturbed by multiplicity. You're not disturbed by the fact that somebody is different from you. Because both know that deep within we are essentially one. So it can only be a psychological change of consciousness. There is no policy or mechanism by which you can arrive at that. It has to be a perception within. So what it means is that the onus is on individuals, the onus is on us as people to really make the effort to be rooted deeper and deeper within. So that our sense of identity is not something superficial. We don't become Indian or whatever else because of how we look or how we dress or what we eat or whatever else. It's a deeper sense of identity that can make you feel grounded. And then you are comfortable with variety. You're okay with difference because you know that there is something else behind. Yeah, this is also a very, very important question. So Sri Aurobindo was actually so when he wrote that book which I referred to in 1915, 1916, this preceded even the League of Nations. As you know, before the United Nations, there was a League of Nations. And the League of Nations was quite a failure for a number of reasons. But he was very optimistic about the fact that these groups were being formed. He said it's very important that we make attempts of bringing people together in order to create supranational entities. So even with the United Nations, which was formed already when he was, in the last years of his life, he felt that it is significant, it is important, it is necessary. And notwithstanding the failures and the challenges, he believed that it was bound to play an important role in maintaining peace and in building a future world order. Now, the problem with bodies like the United Nations, something which even the European Union is facing today, is precisely in trying to interpret unity. What is the next step for unity? Does unity mean that countries should progressively give up on certain identities? I'll give you an example. So in the EU, for example, their challenge is how do we create a sense of Europeanness without losing out on the sense of the separate nation states. And that's what the fear is. So when it came to a common economy or a common market, there is no problem. They're very enthusiastic. even a common currency, was some grumbling. People lost the franc and the lira and so on, but they said, all right, it's still fine because it's practical. But then when it came to, when now currently the European Union is struggling to have a common constitution. Over the last many years, it has been trying to vote in favor of a common constitution and it's not succeeding. And the problem there, of course, is that it hits on this very deep emotive issue that somehow you feel you will lose yourself if you become part of a larger group, and that you don't want to do. So how do we preserve this same conundrum of unity and diversity? The problem with the United Nations, of course, is precisely how does it become a more empowering agency without taking away powers from its member states. So when you try and do it rationally or through any kind of principle-driven approach, you get stuck. And that is again where I think I come back to the idea when he says India has to take a lead, it has a role. It's this knowledge which somehow has to come forward, that when you are rooted in unity, in oneness, you can support diversity. But to answer your question in brief, I think it's very important, and Sri Aurobindo would certainly feel that experiments such as the United Nations have to continue. But I don't really have much to say, except that, of course, this is a very vast field, and there are different approaches. For example, even the understanding of behavior and philosophy and psychology, it's all linked together. It's all quite complex. How do we arrive at this change? I don't know whether it can be done through any external machinery. I think the best that one can possibly do is to make this knowledge accessible, to make it possible for those who are ready or seeking to find that knowledge, to create spaces where individuals can be helped to seek and discover themselves, to create a conducive atmosphere. But beyond that, I don't know whether there is any machinery really, whether it's policy or whatever else that can arrive at a fundamental change of consciousness. But we can certainly encourage that, whether it's in people around us or in our environments, first and foremost by practicing it ourselves. I guess that is really the key thing, and then from there everything else stems. No, this is an important point, and I think the work of Dr. Sampadanand Ji and others is very much in that direction. And the more we, as I said, there is a value in speaking and talking and writing about these things, but ultimately these truths have to be lived and experienced. So thank you very much. I think we'll end here for today. I think there is a conclusion to the program. So